Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome to Fundamentals of Programming course. In today's session we will be talking about structures. Why do we need to use structures in our programs? Where are they used? How are they defined, declared, initialized? What are the things they are composed of? What are data members? What are member functions? All these things we will be talking about today. So let's begin with why there is a need to use structures in our programs. Till now we have seen that when we have multiple things that need to be stored, however these things are related to each other or are identical to each other, we make use of arrays. Array is a kind of data structure that can handle multiple related items. However, it is not always the case. It might be the case when we are storing the marks of the students of a class, then the array can be used, because then every single mark will be of same type. Either it will be integer or it will be floating point number. Similarly, if we are storing the grades of the students of a class, all those grades will be of similar type, like A, B, C, D, F, for example. So they will all be grades and they will be of similar type. So that these are the places where arrays can be used. But now consider a scenario where you are a university administration and you want to store the data of multiple students. Now the data of each student will contain information like the name of a student, like the age of a student, like the GPA of a student, like the pass fail status of a student. So all these things are of different data types. The name might be a character array or a string, the age might be an int, the GPA might be a float or a double, and the pass fail status might be a character that holds the value p/false f. So these are the certain things that we need to store that are related to a single student. Now we have not just one student, we have multiple students. So when we have to store data of multiple things, however those things are not exactly related to each other in every way, we cannot use arrays, because arrays are not designed this way that the data through them can be data like this can be handled through them. That is where structures come into play. Structures are basically the kind of user defined data type, and we can declare our own structures. Now let's see how we can declare our own structures, how we can define and initialize our own structures. So let's start with how we can declare our own structures. We know that structures are basically kind of user defined data types. Just like there are predefined data types like integer, like float, like character, like short integer, like long integer. All these data types are already defined and in the form of keywords like int, char, float, double, and they can be used as it is because they are already defined at the back end. However, sometimes we need to define our own data type, and depending upon our own needs, and that our own defined data type is known as a structure. Basically structure, how can the structure be declared? There is no need to declare primitive data types, already defined data types like int, float, char. All these things are already declared, and we do not need to declare them ourselves. However, as the structures are defined, coming into play according to our own needs, they are defined by us, so they are not already defined or declared at the back end. Structures have to be defined by ourselves according to our needs. For example, if we have to store the data of players, we basically, and we are operating on 4 matrices: the matches, the runs, the average, and the captaincy status. So we have basically 4 different types of data that we need to store for every single player, and then there are multiple players. So arrays cannot be used here, structures will be used here. And as the structure we are declaring here is basically a player. and we know that structure is a user defined data type, we have declared it ourselves first. It is not already defined at the backend like ints, floats, characters, etc. It needs to be declared by ourselves first. How it is declared? It is declared by using a struct keyword. After that comes the name of our own data type, i.e. our structure. After that, there are the elements of a structure. There are basically two elements of a structure: data members, and member functions. Here we have defined just the data members. However, we can also define inside a structure member functions. We have defined data members here. Matches will be of type short int, runs will be of type int, average will be of type float, and captaincy status, that is a variable captain, that will be of type char. So all these data we need to store for every single player. So that all these we have grouped all these under the umbrella of a user defined data type or a structure named player, that is defined through the keyword struct. So struct, name of our structure, the elements that make up our structure, they can be data members or member functions. Data members are basically normal C++ variables, and at the end of structure declaration the semicolon comes. So four things: struct keywords, semicolon, the name of our own data type or our structure, and the members of the function. There are basically two members, data members or member functions. However, here only data members are defined. So that is how we declare a function. Declaration, remember that declaration does not allocate any sort of memory at the back end. Just like if int in itself is nothing, if it is just int, written int, it does not allocate any memory. Similarly, when we declare a structure, it just serves as a blueprint or a prototype for the structure instances that will be defined later on. It in itself is nothing in the memory. It just serves as the blueprint or a prototype. Just like an int written is nothing in itself unless we define a variable int runs. We define a variable like this, only then the memory is allocated to that particular variable. Now after declaration comes the definition and initialization. Definition is just like the definition of a variable. However, here the primitive data type does not come. Here the user defined data type comes. That is basically the name of a structure. The structure is named player here basically, and the instance of that structure is basically Ismail, and the structure's name was player. So it can be any name written here, just like we have int var1, var2. This is basically how we define our simple variables, and this is how we define our structures. First comes the name of the structure, that is basically a user defined data type, and after that comes the instance of a structure. Just like there was a variable, when we are defining a variable, here is the instance of that particular structure, and that is the place where the actual memory is allocated at the back end. Now how do we initialize the members of a structure? These are basically now acting as members of a structure. They are normal C++ variables. However, now they are grouped under the umbrella of a structure named player, and Ismail is the instance of a structure that is named player. So if we have to initialize all these data members that are inside the structure. We remember that how did we used to define initialize the variables. That was basically int var1, and after that we used to write var1 equals to certain value. However, a slight difference comes when we are defining, when we are initializing the data members that are basically the variables present inside the structure. Here the variable was not inside the structure. Here these variables are inside the structure. So they can be initialized, accessed and manipulated through the dot operator. This is basically the dot operator that is used to access the data members or the member functions of the structure. Just like the normal variable does not need to be written to be initialized through a dot operator, it can just be initialized runs equals 0 or vr1 equals 5. The variables that are part of a structure, they need to be initialized using dot operator. First comes the instance of the structure, that was our user defined data type, that was smile here, followed by a dot operator, and after that comes the variable which we want to initialize. Here we were initializing this particular variable by 100, and here we were initializing this particular variable by 5000. Here we were initializing this particular variable by a floating point number 50.0, and here we were initializing this particular number, this particular variable by a character. So that is how we initialize the data members of a structure, and this is how we define a structure before that. And next is basically how we can output the values stored inside these variables that are now under the umbrella of a structure or inside the structure. When we have to write, when we have to output the value of a normal variable, we just use cout runs or cout vr1. However, now those variables are inside the structures, so they can be accessed through the instance of that particular structure. They are basically accessed through the instance smile, and then comes the dot operator, and after that comes the variable in which the value needs to be taken input. Just like we used to write cin, the name of variable, when the variables were independent, here the variable runs is basically part of something bigger than itself, and it can be accessed through the instance of that particular structure. So that instance was this, followed by a dot operator, and after that there was a variable that needed to be accessed, and now we can store the value in that variable that is inside that structure. Similarly, if we want to output the result that is stored in that particular variable inside the structure, we will need to be using we will need to use dot operator, and before the dot operator will come the instance of that particular structure, and after that will come the variable in which we want to the variable which we want to access. So these dot operators allow us to access the variables inside the structures. Another way in which we can initialize this particular thing is that we can initialize the whole structure, all the data members in the following fashion. For example, we write the name of the instance, and after that we group all the data in this particular form. For example, 100, for example 5000, for example 50.0, for example C. So all these arguments will be received in the same sequence in the variables that are defined inside the structure, as they will be passed from here. And now if we skip this 100 will go to matches, this 5000 will go to runs, and this 50.0 will go to average, and this C will go to captain. Now the important thing to notice here is that if we skip any argument, it will cause ambiguity, because the compiler receives all these arguments in the sequence. This 100 goes in the matches, this 5000 goes in the runs, and this C goes into the average. Now this C was meant for captain, not for average. So average will now be set to 67, which is basically the ASCII of C. So care needs to be taken that we are passing things in the same fashion as the arguments have, as the variables are present inside the structures. So this was basically the declaration, definition and initialization of a structure. Now we will move on to how we can, what are basically the elements of a structure, or the things that are present inside the structure called the members, and we will look into the details of that. Now we will talk about the members of a structure, i.e. the things that basically make up the structures. The structure is basically composed of two things, two members, data members and the member functions. Data members are normal C++ variables and member functions are normal C++ functions. If you are not familiar with the C++ function, you can watch this video that is attached at this particular link and you can learn from there. The structure is basically composed of two members, data members and member functions. Data members are normal C++ variables and member functions are normal C++ functions. So this is our structure, that is basically a user defined data type, a kind of a user defined data type, and it is named player. It comprises of these data and data members that are basically very simple variables of type shortened, int, float, character, grouped under the single name, that is basically a structure player, and these can be accessed through the instance of that particular structure, that is Ismail in this case, and these variables can be accessed and manipulated. Now after the data members there are member functions. Member functions are similar to what the function we studied till now. This is basically a function that is defined here. This is a function name, there is no argument that is coming into this function. This is its return type, and it just returns the number of runs that are basically stored in the variables runs at that particular moment. So whenever the user will call the function get runs, this function will fetch the runs from this particular variable present inside the structure for the user. Similarly, this is an important function of this particular structure. This function, what this function does is basically updates the data every single time the match is played. For example, a match is played around the world, and we are entering the runs scored by any player in that particular match as an input to this function. It takes that input and updates all the data of runs, matches and average. It just simply increments the matches by 1. It increments the run tally by the current runs plus the new match runs, and it updates the average by new runs and new matches. So all the data is updated through this particular function when it receives new match runs as an input. Similarly, there is a third function named display. It just displays all the data that is basically stored in these variables matches, runs and average on the screen whenever user calls for the display of data. Now this is basically our main program. This is where structure ends. Now structure starts from here and ends here. These are data members, these are member functions. So in the main program we define the instance of a structure, and the instance is named Ismail here, and the structure is named player. Now we initialize the elements of that particular data members of that particular structure in this format, making sure that all the things are going in the same sequence as the variables are defined here. After that, what we did was we basically called the get runs function. Get runs function is this one. We call this particular function get runs, and when a function is inside the structure, it is called using dot operator, and before the dot operator the instance of that particular structure. Had it been a normal function, this thing would not have been written here. It would have just been something like cout get runs. However, now this function get runs is present inside a structure. So we have to call it using the dot operator, and before the dot operator comes the name of the instance of that particular structure. So now when this function will be called, it will display on screen whatever the value that will be present in the variable runs, and that value we passed here was 5000. So 5000 will get printed on the console. So after that we take input from user, enter runs of new match, and whatever user enters goes into the variable new runs that is basically defined here in the main program. And when the new match function is called and the input of new runs is given, new match function is called here, and the input that we took from user here is passed on to that function. It receives that input in this at this particular place, and it basically updates all the data of matches, runs and average. So all the data that is stored here in these variables inside the structure gets updated when this function is called in. This input is passed, and now the structure holds the updated values. After that, at the end, we want to display that particular updated data. So here we can write on console, enter runs of new match. This thing will be written here. User will enter, for example, user enters 40 runs. When user will enter 40 runs here, it will increment the match by +1. So now the new data that will be held in this particular variable will be, it was 100 before and now it will be 101. This thing will now hold the value 5040, and this particular thing average will fall below 50, because I have scored less than 50 runs in this particular match. So 40 it will basically be added. So here the value 5040 by 101 will get updated. That will be most likely 49 point something. So in this particular case, when we will call the display function, it will print the updated matches. It will print 101 on the screen. After that, it will print, we can assume that there is a new line character here. Updated runs, that will be 5040, and updated average, that will be 49 point something. So that is how the data members and the member functions work with each other, and they basically form the members of the structure. So that is how the structures are basically composed of. Structures are composed of two things: data members and member functions, and the member functions can update the data members present inside the structure. The difference is the same, that the functions that are present inside the structure can be accessed through the dot operator and the instance of that particular structure, and all the other things remain the same. So that is basically it from the structures.